Believe it or not, Vikings once used skulls as containers for storing drinking water during their perilous raids. Okay, scratch that. However, how the Vikings managed life at sea with limited resources remains a great mystery. In today's video, we'll show you the surprisingly innovative methods Vikings used to fetch and preserve water on their long voyages. From using natural materials as storage to the techniques that prevented water from spoiling. We'll give you all the gist of the Viking survival skills you need. Don't touch that dial because some of the survival strategies would shock you and give you a new POV. Between AD 800 and the 11th century, many Vikings started exploring places beyond their lands. They initially targeted easy spots like unprotected monasteries along the coast of the British Isles, making their first marks as raiders and pirates in such places. But they didn't stop there. Over the next 300 years, these adventurous Vikings would go on to spread out far and wide. They weren't just raiders, they also became traders and settlers, making a home in many parts of Europe and in distant lands like Russia, Iceland, Greenland, and even Newfoundland. Their impact on these areas was significant, leaving a lasting legacy we can still see today. The reasons why Vikings left their own homeland to explore far-off lands are not entirely clear and remain one of the biggest mysteries about their kind. Some historians think it might have been because there were too many people and not enough land at home. However, the first Vikings who set sail were said to mainly search for treasures rather than new territories to settle. One of the most famous events that kicked off what we now call the Viking Age happened in AD 793. The Vikings attacked the Lindisfarne Monastery, located off the coast of Northumberland in northeastern England. They didn't completely destroy the monastery, but their raid was shocking enough to send fear through European religious communities. This bold and sudden assault made it clear that the Vikings were a force to be reckoned with. But many thought their victory wouldn't last long. How would they survive the different non-human obstacles that were ahead? Well, they found a way. In the 9th century, adventurous Scandinavians, mostly Norwegians, set their sights on Iceland, a sparsely populated island in the North Atlantic. By the end of the 10th century, some of these settlers, including the infamous Erik the Red, went further west to Greenland. This would mean that they had to go on long trips that lasted for many days. Water was going to be a big problem. But they figured out a way, traveling short. It actually took Vikings about 200 years to make their way across the Atlantic, exploring and settling on each new island they discovered one by one. Once these routes were established, traveling between the islands could be done in just a few days, showing the Vikings' remarkable ability to adapt and navigate the vast ocean. Additionally, Viking voyages were quite strategic, mainly sticking to familiar routes where they could easily hop from one known settlement to another. This way, they rarely spent more than a day or two at sea at a time, which allowed them to carry just enough provisions and restock as needed. A Viking ship known as a knar was particularly useful for these trips. It could hold up to 24 tons, making it ideal for carrying supplies and goods for trade. Unlike explorers who later tackled vast oceans like the Pacific or Indian Oceans, the Vikings mostly kept the coasts within sight. Their journeys connected them from places like Norway or Sweden to Scotland, and from there to Iceland and Greenland. These routes even brought them as far as North America, reaching Newfoundland and possibly Hudson Bay. The environments they traveled through offered plenty of resources. They could sometimes use ice floes and icebergs for fresh water, and the rivers and streams were handy not just for drinking, but also for disposing of waste. The abundant wildlife in these areas provided them with necessary food, allowing them to hunt game and fish and gather edible plants along their routes. This abundance of natural resources made Viking voyages feasible and allowed them to explore vast stretches of the North Atlantic. But how exactly did they manage to carry enough water to stay hydrated even on their long transatlantic trips? It would seem like a big deal and a bit of a mystery, especially when you think about how later explorers in the 16th century tackled this problem. Those explorers, heading from Europe to America, would load up some barrels of fresh water to last them through the 30 to 40-day journey. Unfortunately, even with all that preparation, some still didn't make it. Now, comparing those 16th century ships to Viking ships, a notable difference in design makes things more complicated. The ships used later on had deeper drafts, which means they sat lower in the water and had more room below deck for storing things like water and food. But Viking ships, on the other hand, were much shallower. You could expect that because, after all, they were primarily built for war. The design allowed them to move quickly and land on beaches, leaving them with far less storage space. But they had enough water and stored well too. It's pretty impressive when you think about it. They must have been very resourceful, perhaps using every little bit of space wisely and relying on techniques and knowledge that helped them make the most of what they had. These days, if you find yourself stranded somewhere, you can use a nifty gadget called a solar still. This little device acts like a mini greenhouse. You put salt water inside, some scientific magic happens, and fresh water drips down where you can collect and drink it. Similarly, you can catch water using a large plastic bag over a tree branch, but they didn't have these. It's quite possible that the Vikings, known for their ingenuity, could have used something like a thin skin or cloth to create a similar effect. That wasn't the only way. Many Viking voyages took place in shallow waters close to shorelines, allowing sailors to stop and collect fresh water from time to time. For the longer periods at sea, they carried water in barrels or large troughs. Archaeological discoveries, such as the Norwegian ship burials at Oseberg and Gokstad, revealed that troughs could hold up to 500 liters or even 750 liters of water. Historical records suggest that each person needed at least 4 liters of water daily to stay active. So even though the Vikings didn't have modern technology, they were pretty clever about managing their water supplies during the long periods of sea voyages. During their voyages, Vikings were quite resourceful in how they got their fresh water. Whenever it rained, for instance, that was like the breath of fresh water from heaven for them. They seized every chance to refill their water supplies, cleverly using a sailcloth system to catch rainwater, directing it straight into their barrels from the sails. They first let some rainwater wash away any salt residue on the sail to ensure the water was clean. After the initial rinse, they would taste the water flowing off the sail, and if it tasted sweet and not salty, into the barrel it went, and voila! There was water for them again. Other than the big barrels, there were other small ones too. Among the artifacts found on the Viking ship at Oseberg was a smaller 125-liter barrel. These smaller barrels were likely easier to handle and keep on the narrow decks of the Viking longships. This setup showed the Vikings' practical creativity and ability to adapt to the challenging conditions of sea travel, ensuring they had enough fresh water for their journeys. Imagine a fleet of Viking ships sailing together across the vast ocean. But some do not exactly carry warriors. According to Snorre Sturlason, a famous Icelandic saga poet, the Norwegian kings didn't just send warriors on these ships. They also made sure there were dedicated supply and transport ships. These special ships carried extra food and water and other necessities, making sure that the entire fleet was well provisioned during their long voyages. Life on board was communal, especially when it came to drinking water. The crew shared a large trough where their drink was stored to keep it clean and safe. When this trough ran dry, they refilled it from smaller barrels. This way of sharing kept everyone up and going and created a sense of unity among the crew as they faced the challenges of the sea together. One cannot miss out on the many speculations about how they survived the long voyages. Some believe that while the Vikings couldn't access the advanced water purification systems we use today, they could still gather ice or scoop up snow, melting it over fires to get their water. By using these methods and many others, the Vikings ensured they had enough water to drink, cook, and clean, even when far from their homelands.